Welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Roxana Chiappa, and I have the pleasure and honor to be one of the conveners of this panel called Facing the Traps of Decolonial Critiques and Open Up for Other Ways of Existing Inside, Outside, Beyond Academia. As I said, I am one of the conveners because my two co-inspirators are in the Southern Hemisphere. It's 7 a.m. in Brazil, and Juliana Martínez, who is saying hi from Florianopolis, and Juliana Evelyn da Silva from Ouro Preto. Did I say all right? Yeah. And today our invitation is to talk a little bit about people who feel called with decolonial theories, with critical projects, how we unconsciously may fall into those practices that we criticize. So it's an invitation to dive deeper in the context, in our context, to think beyond academia and especially to listen with the heart. And we have an amazing panel. One of the panelists is Francesca Helm, who is next to me. Francesca is an academic from the University of Padova. Her research is at the intersection of decolonial approaches and language education and educational technology, language policy, linguistic landscapes, interculturality, and critical internationalization studies. Thank you, Francesca, for being here. Very much. Yeah. And is also with us our colleague, Hiba Ibrahim, who is a PhD candidate in applied linguistics at York University. Hello, Hiba. Her dissertation explores the interculturality and intercultural learning experiences of university students in lingua franca, virtual exchange. Her research interests include telecollaboration and virtual exchange, cultural language and identity, intercultural competence, in addition to language learning. It's really a pleasure to have you here, Hiba. And finally, I want to introduce my other colleague, Francesca DellOlio. Francesca has Francesca, hello. Francesca has a PhD in humanities from the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. Her research interests encompass the examination of identity formation within language education processes, particularly in migrant contexts. She also conducts research on interculturality, linguistic, social, and educational policies and practices, as well as in her studies she includes decolonial and post-colonial studies. So we have divided this presentation, and there we are. I was missing that picture. We have divided this presentation in 3 moments. And the first moment, we want to talk about our locus of enunciation and why it's so important for us, people who epistemology locate ourselves in the global south, about decolonial traps. And for that, I'm going to give the floor to my colleague, Juliana Martínez. Juliana, yours.
Hello, Rox. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Good morning. It's very early for me, so I am still connecting myself here. Yeah, but thank you, Rox, for this kind introduction. Can you hear me well? Is it working well? Yeah?
Okay. I can hear you well.
So thank you for this kind introduction. And it's a great pleasure to be here in this panel with these amazing women and who are my friends. I'm very proudly to say that we are friends. So it's very good to see all of you. And as Rock just mentioned, we are going to start talking about how we understand decoloniality and where we are located. But it's also important to say that we planned this panel slightly different from the traditional academic setting, because we really would like to find ways to engage in dialogue and to listen carefully to each other and generate mutual learnings as an experience of a different kind of a praxis in these attempts of not separating who we are from what we do in our academic spaces, settings, and not just using decolonial studies or decolonial theories for theoretical purposes, for discursive purposes. So this is the attempt that we would like to bring. And that's why we raised the question, what do we mean by decolonial work and how are we connected to it? And you see there this name, Abiyala, which is the name for the Americas before America became America. Yeah, Latin America, South America, North America. So we are trying to connect with what we have from our location. So so for us, thinking about decoloniality, we see it as a field of study, a field of research and teaching, but not only that, we see it as not just in academic terms, but we see it in existential relations, how we exist in decolonial terms, and how we embody the experiences that we've been facing in life, in professional life, in personal life. So that's why we don't take the decoloniality as in universal terms, is not taken for granted for us. So some of the things that we are going to speak here and share with you are connected to who we are, where we come from, and how we are making sense of our spaces, and not just in geographical terms, but also in ontological, epistemic Global South. We may be located in Global South from different ways, and you are going to see here that we're going to speak from different voices, from different places. We come from different places, but we try to find an epistemological encounter in terms of Global South. And just to raise some points to understand how we see decoloniality as an invitation, okay? Just to state a little bit of that. So we understand that we come from this dominant, hegemonic, and Western logics of living, and we project a kind of a narcissistic society that operates in so many differences and erasing differences under the name of neoliberalism and capitalism and consumerism, and we tend to individualize ourselves in this way of living in this narcissistic society. And the production of this narcissistic society is the idea of sameness. The sameness is the process of invisible violence that sometimes we see. We erase ourselves, erase the others, we erase the possibilities, the coexistences, the relations. So living in this world doesn't invite us to deal with difference and diversity, and even to look at the colonial histories, because we are under this idea of comfort, sameness, privilege, whiteness, and this apparently sameness doesn't hurt, doesn't take us away from our comfort zones if we don't see beyond that. So we find ourselves in this neoliberal game, sometimes in isolation, in self-alienation, in apolitical, ahistorical views that separate ourselves from one another without even realize who we are, where we come from, and how we feel about it, where we are heading, or how we are implicated in the complexities, the inequalities, the complicities, and even in the challenges that we face today when we look at this planetary community. So this is how we engage with decolonial studies, and how we've been doing this exercise of looking at our locus of enunciation as an invitation to reconceptualize or even to resituate ourselves in terms of what we look at as problems and crises and issues to be transformed, because we see that for many times decoloniality is projected as solution for such problems that we face nowadays. And this has a lot to do with how we make sense of reality, how we face otherness, how we face our own complicity. So in decolonial terms, this otherness is not only projected to the invisibility, because it's easier to maintain ourselves in the sameness, but with the idea of a hegemonic globalization, let's use the vocabulary that we are more, we usually talk about globalization, so this hegemonic capitalist global makes us kind of a blind in regard to other realities, to the multiple realities that surround us, the multiple worlds that cross our existence and implicate with one another. So we kind of see ourselves in these global imaginaries of a more equitable and just society, but there is the tendency to avoid the complex, the historical, the systemic conversations, the beyond reforms that we are interested in looking at. So what happens in this sense of reality intertwined with capitalism and hegemonic globalization is this inseparability of what we call modernity and coloniality. They are intertwined, constitutive conditions of existence. So one doesn't exist without the other, and they are two sides of the same coin. Or as we already heard, coloniality is the darker side of modernity. There is no one without the other, and that's why there is no genuine globalization without violence, hierarchies, inequalities, unequal power relations. So there is no capitalism without human and non-human suffering in this sense. So globalization is this perpetuation and preservation of colonialism. And that's why when we are looking at decoloniality, we want to understand the process of living the experience of colonization and how coloniality and still colonialism are very much present nowadays in a historical process in different ways. When we look at the racism in Brazil, we look at this history, but also when we see the violence, for example, in Gaza and the genocide that we are living right now, we just confirm that it's not just coloniality that remains, but colonialism very much alive. So this experience, this process of violent colonization, constitutes this foundation of hierarchies and inequalities that we see in our life today, related to race, to class, to gender, to culture, to language, to knowledge. So new institutions of a global capitalism. Okay, so that's what we see ourselves implicated in this global world system, in the contemporary global capitalism and different hegemonic forms, and how there are these hierarchies and inequalities are implanted, are part of a kind of our mental construction, how we reinforce and how we are implicated in this process, reproducing unequal power relations, and how our academic spaces also are part of it. So it's not just the social imaginary, how we are constituted, but also how this intertwined modernity, coloniality cannot be forgotten in terms of what we do in our academic spaces. And this is what we are going to open up here to talk today, how we produce, for example, epistemic racism, and how racism is not just in terms of ethnicity and race, but also how we produce knowledge, what we understand by knowledge, how we accept knowledge. That's why it's also an attempt to have this different space. Okay, so then we in terms of what we see coloniality implicating the way that we produce knowledge and what we understand by knowledge, how we wanted to transform this knowledge production emerged from a white European heterosexual and Christian tradition. How can we change that? Because the consequence is exclusion and extinction and of other voices, other bodies. So we wanted to re-look at this space and see ourselves implicated in that. So what should we do then? We ask ourselves, and this is a question that is going to follow us this morning. So we speak about decoloniality as an invitation to engage in this kind of problems and way of looking life. So how we navigate in these turbulent waters, and how do we challenge and change the terms of the conversation and start raising different questions, denaturalizing this mainstream narrative that limits Global South to a position of inequality, lacking, failing, but also in scrutinizing this myth of the benefits of the global designs that are implanted in our local histories. That's why the importance of looking at our locus of enunciation. Okay, I think that's it to start how we see ourselves connected to confronting coloniality, modernity, but also to learn and unlearn several other possibilities of coexistence, and that's why we are here together in this panel.
Thank you, Juliana. And if I can just add a line, is that your words really speak that the position of Global South is not just geographically, it's an epistemological position that has ontological ramification. And within the Global South, there are different Souths. And this is something that also we want to unpack. Instead of having a homogeneous vision of what it means that someone say, oh, I'm coming from that place and I resonate, there are so many nuances in that positionality. And we want to unpack the question, so why are we engaging with the idea of traps? And what do we mean with it when we refer to the decolonial critique? Why we're so keen to speak about it? And I'm going to give the floor to my colleague, Jhuliane.
Okay, hello, good morning, everyone. It's lovely to be here. It's just such a special occasion, right, to be talking to you all. And as you can see in the title of this panel, we have the idea of trampas, right? And this is such an idea that we have been discussing in our group for some time at least. And I'd like to contextualize, to talk a little bit about how this emerged and how we have been facing, right, the constraints and the limits, the possibilities of this idea, okay? So the decolonial work and the decolonial theory have been buzzwords, right, around the world for some time, especially in the social sciences, education, and applied linguistics, which is my area, for example, and also at least in the Latin American spaces, right? As any buzzword, it started to lose its initial meaning and critique, being very easily co-opted by neoliberalism, and even in our academic structures. We listen very every time, right, that I'm here at the university, we say, oh, decolonial this, decolonial work, let's decolonize. But sometimes you do not know what we mean by this, right? And the meanings are very different, very different. So with this discomfort in mind, we felt that we needed to discuss the complexities we found in decolonial work and how decoloniality could generate less harmful projects and relationships when these same complexities were considered. So by the end of 2022, we invited scholars around the world to discuss how we could inhabit the otherwise in international academia, focusing on the critiques, complexities, struggles, and re-existences they found in their local institutions, especially when they were informed by decolonial perspectives, right? So in this special issue published on the Journal of Comparative and International Higher Education in 2023, we also contributed a paper on trampas, right, which is traps, inspired by the work of Rita Segato. Our argument in the paper was that even when scholars engaged with decolonial critiques and decolonial aspirations towards international education, the structures of universities were so heavily influenced by colonial legacies that the potentialities of decolonial work were undermined. So to make our point, we focused on three initiatives that are frequently seen as projects or good projects that deviate from hegemonic discourses of internationalization, but they actually do not, right? In the first initiative, South-South cooperation projects, we reflected on how the notion of global South tended to hold a geographical meaning, as Roxana has just mentioned, right? Naturally assuming a position of resistance, when we know that the actors are very differently positioned in this modern colonial matrix of power, and that they continue to invest in aspirations of leadership and prestige, for example, in our universities, right? So global South partners, or including these partners alone, does not interrupt the hegemonic model of internationalization as we know it, right? It's not only a question of including, if we do not change the terms of the conversation, if we do not if we do not know why we are internationalizing, what is the reason, right? So doing one thing alone does not solve the problem. In the second initiative, the policies and projects that seek to address and question colonial legacies, we addressed the case of Brazilian quota system that allows othered or minoritized people, right, to enter, to have access to university. But the trampa here is that these projects may push transformation up to an individual level, not to the structural level. So it may lead to an apolitical and ahistorical fight in the academic scenario. In the third initiative, Teaching and Researching Committed to Decolonial Intentions, we focused on how coloniality manifests in different dimensions of our lives as scholars, right? Even when we actively engage with decolonial critique. So we were thinking about our own lives here as academics, in Chile, in Brazil, in different parts of Brazil, right? So although we were able to produce this cognitive-based critique against the modern colonial academic system, and we could also produce critique about our hidden aspirations, we also kept investing in the continuation of this shiny and just promise, which is academia, right? At least to most of us. So I believe this text was the result of a long conversation. We've been talking about this for a long time, right? And much discomfort. So back then, we already considered the relations, the reflection on trampas and our contradictions to be necessary. Why? Not to lose sight of the ongoing and relational character of our decolonial projects. However, it is important to emphasize that our discussions and discomfort continued, right? We wrote, we did something, but then we kept changing, thinking and reflecting because we are changing all the time, right? And we thought more fully about how can we live decolonial scholarship? How can we see those things otherwise? How can we practice the decoloniality, right? So we've now been exploring that these trampas are not only a discursive issue, right? They go beyond situating our locus of enunciation, especially when it's taken as an excuse not to act or not to engage fully in transformative practices, right? Because sometimes this may happen. They go beyond engaging with decolonial theory and its analytical work. Sometimes we say that we are dealing with decoloniality, but we are only producing and publishing and publishing and publishing, but our action is just focusing on that. They go beyond recognizing the entanglements of modernity and coloniality, right? So the very concept of trampas is generative when it allows us to recognize our complicity in harm, when we enact a deep compromise with change, when we can sit and stay with the discomfort, with the violence, with the ugly truths that are brought by this type of work, which is very hard to do, right? So sometimes I want to think of projects and jump to quick solutions, especially when we have the social justice as something that we really want to achieve, right? We also want to change. We want to transform the inequalities, but we do not even consider identifying and interrogating our desires, giving up our privileges, engaging with the complexities and the complicity of our existence in this world, right? So we need to develop a genuine desire to learn, to understand the problem, the limitations, and the complexities of any project that we want to develop, be they decolonial or not, right? So we also recognize that we are not gatekeepers of decolonial scholarship, yes, but understanding its deep compromise with an otherwise in a planetary scale, as Ju has already mentioned, we've been trying to experience this decolonial perspective concretely, right, in our lives as a way of living, as a way of existing here. So there is no purity here or in any other decolonial or more critical work in which we want to engage. The intention of the concept of trampas is to be aware of the circularities, the limitations, the possibilities, and the impossibilities that our work has, especially when we are dealing with our work inside the university. So the logics that inform us in academia is itself a trampa, right? As we think that being cannot be reduced to knowing. And we know that we have a privilege, right, of the knowing, of the cognition in academia, of the reasoning. So now as we acknowledge that we have gotten past a pure cognitive logic of knowledge production and knowledge conception, giving space to our affective reactions, we've been talking more about our emotions, right, in our body. we can see that we are used to assuming a discursive deconstruction stance that not necessarily advocated a course of action in the real world. This happened because in some discussions that we had, we were originally engaged with post-colonial or post-structuralist, right, critical theories, and they helped us a lot to understand the world. However, we were in the level of the critique, in the level of the discourse, right? And then we thought that this was not enough. So the idea of trampa is very much related to a desire to escape modernity. Its roots are in the separability we continue to see in the terms of the conversation, right? So when we bring it to conversation, when we bring the idea of trampa to conversation, is because we see that it encourages us to foster solidarity, resistance, right? And different pedagogies. It translates our genuine desire to live in an entangled, dependent, interrelated world full of tensions. So if my friends would like to add something, it is the space. But I think when we were talking about the idea of trampa, we were very much thinking of the tensions, right? The circularities and how it could help us engage in, or at least to find these projects, these decolonial projects that are in the horizon, right? That are yet to be done.
If I can add a line and share a little bit how is the process of how we engage in this epistemic transnational solidarity project with whom I share with my colleagues here, we find and we engage in the dialogue and among the topics that are touching our hearts in our work, and we find ourselves trying to find a solution to the injustice that we are living. So we think, okay, let's think otherwise. And we are trying to engage with a project without trying to go beyond that coloniality, right? And when we go beyond that coloniality, we find ourselves, oh, look at this. We are reproducing the linear way of thinking in modernity that we will bring a solution and that will allow us to move forward. And that this is something that we are confronted with in our emotions. My heart is telling me that I'm very nervous now because what I'm sharing is like, okay, academia asked us to have a solution, to show something, okay, how we move forward. But this process of reflection and building otherwise not necessarily gives you a solution. It actually brings you more question and shows you the complicity that you have with the system, what we are criticizing. So what come next is an invitation to talk about how we see engage with these trampas. And I'm going to give the floor now and my colleagues to engage in this invitation with 3 questions. First, how do we understand the colonial work in our context? What are the projects with which we are engaging that go beyond the critique of coloniality inside and outside of academia? And how do we see ourselves going beyond those traps? And if you allow me, could I give the floor to Hiba to start? Wherever you want to. We are not.
We're not hearing you. Hang on, we'll just check with the.
She muted on her. Unmuted.
No, because she's unmuted.
No.
You're not mute. It seems like you're muted, Hiba.
Unmuted herself.
No?
It's the sound from the others work.
Yeah, maybe we can start.
It's
we
it's
check.
our computer.
I thought Juliana and Jhuliane worked.
No, I think you can hear me. Yes, it's working.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, and Hiba has just opened the microphone and the sound's not coming.
It might be streaming from her end or the browser she's using.
She could try logging in on the
Maybe
browser.
can you log in another computer and another device?
Or another browser.
Okay. And in that sense, Francesca DellOlio, would you like to start?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, great. So, first of all, I'm really glad and grateful to be here, to be online here. So thank you for inviting me and to give me the opportunity of having this dialogue with you as panelists and you as who is joining us in this room. So just to introduce myself, I wanted to tell you a little bit about my locus of enunciation. So I was born and raised in Italy in a white monocultural context. I studied in Italy at the University of Padova, cultural and linguistic mediation, and I was fascinated by otherness, so the idea of diversity. And I grew up within the frame of European humanism, believing in the narrative of a tolerant, plural, and harmonious Europe. So at that time, I had not yet questioned what my body, white, European, heterosexual, female, communicated beyond my intentions. So I had not considered how my voice carried the weight of colonial histories, and I had never been taught to recognize it. So when I arrived in São Paulo, I spent my last almost 12 years in São Paulo. I brought with me this unexamined perspective. I believe in an harmonic and peaceful intercultural dialogue, but it was exactly in the encounters that are intercultural in the sense of real, complex, embodied, and affective, and also conflictual, that I began to dismantle this belief. So living and working in Brazil, I began to experience the tension and negotiations that emerge when you truly engage across asymmetries of power and history. So through solidarity, conflict, moments of dissonance and misunderstanding, I was slowly confronted with the limits of my own worldview. And I began to realize that the diversity I had once celebrated was entangled in a Eurocentric framework that continued to invisibilize, extract, and appropriate. So what I had seen as inclusive was, in fact, a perpetuation of coloniality, masked as openness. So much of this transformation happened in classroom. I have been teaching Italian as a foreign language since then, and my students became also my teachers. As I studied critical and decolonial theories, I took my PhD in São Paulo, as Rox said when he introduced me. I saw them reflected and embodied in our daily practice. So I saw these critical and decolonial theories embodied in our daily practice. So my students brought me their own family histories and stories, their desires, their affective connections to Italy, connections that often transcended the normative frameworks of nationality, language, and identity. And to add something to my locus of enunciation, it is also shaped by contradictions of academic precarity. As I said, I have a PhD in Brazil, then a visiting fellowship at the University of London, and now I'm teaching in a public high school in northern Italy, within a system that is increasingly shaped by capitalist and neoliberal imperatives with very unstable contracts. So there is little room for care, for slowness, and for listening. And I do not share these as a gesture of complaints, but to show how colonial logics, as Zhu just said, quietly infiltrate our daily rhythm, our professional path, and our pedagogical choices, revealing that even our most well-intentioned acts can be entangled in the very system we seek to dismantle. So in this space, I'm trying to imagine what the colonial praxis might look like in education. So to explore how we understand the colonial work in our specific context, especially in times when critique alone no longer suffices, I'll be speaking from this place of tension, border zone between academia and practice, and between critique and possibility. So I think that it's important to underline what the article Roxana and Jhu mentioned, that is called Un poco mais de calma, remind us the colonial work must resist being reduced to a new theoretical commodity. So it's not about rushing into critique. It's about listening, slowing down, making room for other epistemologies and temporalities. And so I think that this is the first step. I think it's important to me to point out, because it's the modern capitalistic urgency to produce, to perform, and to be legible within academic terms. And I was thinking about another thinker, that is Byung-Chul Han, that is a Korean thinker and also based in Germany, that identifies it as the society of performance. And the important point here is that we internalize these capitalist imperatives and exploit ourselves, believing we are actually free. And the important point in this is that it's that we are willing to push ourselves to exhaustion, convinced that we are pursuing self-realization, and this is limitless. So we exploit ourselves until we break down. And I see this trap in my own work in a high school in Italy, under the weight of a hyper-bureaucratized educational system infused with performance indicators, neoliberal expectations. I find myself with barely enough time to engage in authentic, transformative relationships with the student. Precarious labor, unstable contracts, and the pressure to perform reinforce a reality where language teaching becomes about preparing students for tests and certificates, not for reflection, connection, or relationality in intercultural encounters. So we can see here that the colonial work feels stiffed by structural constraints. And yet, I think this is precisely where the colonial praxis must begin, not in abstraction, but in these everyday confrontations with the modern colonial system. So this is where the coloniality becomes, again, a matter of ethics and politics of relation, not abstractly, but in everyday pedagogical choices. So just to finish, if I'm exceeding the time, please tell me. As a counterpoint, I bring here a project in which I recently engaged during my visiting fellowship at the University of London. There was a reading group called in Italian Gruppo di Lettura Decoloniale, Decolonial Reading Group. That was a reading group with Brazilian students of Italian descent, many of whom are actually learners of Italian as a heritage language. So I was trying to carve a space for what the article described as a process of listening and encounters. We read works by Italian authors with migrant backgrounds, and we ask ourselves, what does it mean to be Italian? Who gets to define Italianness? How does language shape our sense of belonging? And the important thing is that the sessions weren't about arriving at answers, but about building shared meaning through encounters. So we read different authors who disturbed the canonical understanding of Italian identity. And these moments, I think that even if small, enact what Catherine Walsh calls cracks. So openings that fracture that the colonial matrix and allow for something else to emerge, something else that is the yet unknown. One of my main questions in this project, then I can speak more about it, but just to finish introducing this, finishing this part, was trying to think about languages, national borders, identities, and migration, shifting from a paradigm of borders to one of borderlands. The borderlands as a vague and indeterminate place created by emotional residue of an unnatural boundary. So we do so entering an emphatic space through effects and relationality. And the high point in this project was an online meeting with Raymond Karam, that is a migrant who crossed the Mediterranean and generously shared his life history with us. So it was online, but I think that it was very important for us to have a dialogue with him actually, and to move beyond the text. So we read, as I said, these authors, but we also had this encounter, and it reminded us that language education, when practiced decolonially, is not only about words of grammar, but about creating spaces where voices that carry the weight of history and displacement can be heard. So the idea was to think about the dynamics of language education, not merely as a reflection of historical injustice, but also terrain for ongoing resistance and reinscription of identity in face of coloniality. So I brought these two examples just to share with you this space in which I live, in which I work. It is a very, let's say, border zone space, because I'm always passing from a space to another, and also to compare the differences between a space that is an institutional space, that is the high school, and also a space where it was more, I had more, let's say, possibilities to propose intercultural and decolonial way of thinking about language education. But yet, obviously, we are always in this system of modern and colonial word system. So this was just, I mean, I can then speak more about one of these two projects, but was just to introduce my idea of what I understand as a decolonial work in my context.
Thank you so much, Francesca. Thank you for bringing us this idea of cracks that happens in the microspaces, and your role of inviting high school students to engage in different way, bring different contexts in spaces like schools that are extremely constrained by national regulations and very nationalistic ways of thinking about the territory and the identity. Hiba, would you like that you would try to your mic? Let's see.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
Your
great.
image looks frozen a bit, but I trust that it will change in a minute. But we can hear you.
I'm now connected from my tablet, so I'm not sure how the camera is doing, but if you can hear me, I guess that's better than nothing. Is the picture coming okay?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, I would like to thank everybody here for being part of this conversation, I think, which will always be an ongoing conversation with everything we're witnessing in the world today. As Roxana introduced me, my name is Hiba Ibrahim, and I am a Palestinian Jordanian. I'm basically now in Amman, Jordan, speaking to you, but I'm also doing my PhD in Canada, so I'm kind of in between both countries to finish my PhD. Before doing my PhD, I was involved in intercultural and global education on different levels. I was still an educator myself, and I was also a practitioner in the intercultural education space, where I coordinated virtual exchange programs between students in the MENA region and also North America in particular. You know, I was a student myself here in university. I grew up, I was born in Kuwait, but I moved with my family, just like many, you know, hundreds and thousands of Palestinian families when, you know, the first Gulf War happened. We moved to Jordan. You know, at that time, I was a Jordanian citizen. With all the, you know, complexities of history, my origins are Palestinian, but I do not hold any like official documentation that proves it. So in front of the law and, you know, the world, I'm just holding the Jordanian citizenship, which I think you can imagine how this can really impact the way you think of coloniality and decoloniality, even from a very young age. Even growing up in Jordan, it was really a big question for me of, you know, why am I experiencing all these experiences of feeling a minority, even in an Arab Muslim country where I feel that I'm not necessarily, you know, exposed to opportunities that the people in this country have. Really big questions started in my head at a young age. And I think what really kind of deepened these questions are my growing interest in the literature of diaspora, you know, the question of identity as a BA student of English language and lit. And they kind of stayed with me, you know, with my service work. I basically work with a lot of Gazan scholars and students till the moment. And it was this kind of two realities of, you know, me being a Palestinian outside of Palestine, but also being connected to my homeland, right? To people from Gaza and also the West Bank where I, you know, originally come from. And reflecting on this question of, you know, I'm personally maybe not experiencing occupation directly. I don't live under occupation. I work with people under occupation. I do have extended family who live under occupation, but I'm also living here, you know, having all these opportunities and kind of learning all of these things. What am I gonna do with it? That was a very big question that grew, you know, with me as an emerging scholar, also as an educator, as a practitioner. And I think the current work I do with Gaza in particular has made it super clear to me that for me, in my own context, in this moment, as we call it in the conversation, decolonial work is all about sumud in Arabic, which is, you know, steadiness and perseverance in a way that I keep questioning myself. What can I do, and what will I continue to reflect on as a scholar, as an educator, as a Palestinian woman, to basically do my best, not just to promote voices, but, you know, to make my voice and people like me, the voices of people like me, on the table, because I think those are the voices that really matter these days. And it's a big question because of different challenges, really. And I think maybe I'm getting to the second moment here, and that is you're always surrounded by challenges that make you also question whether the work you're doing is valid or not. And I think one of the biggest challenges, I think the wider challenges that I feel impact even my daily work with Gazan students is, for instance, this idea of thinking or including education as part of humanitarian aid. You know, we always use this phrase of educations in emergencies, but when you really reflect on the language and where this is coming from and political connotations that come with it, for instance, it makes me wonder whether if I am, for instance, supporting my students to apply for scholarships and leave Gaza and, like, you know, do their graduate studies abroad, am I really supporting them, you know, to obtain a brighter future? Or am I maybe pushing the agenda of, you know, ethnic cleansing, or, like, you know, just having them easing this, you know, this road for them to leave and continue their lives? although you're not like involved in such an action, but you cannot really, you cannot really hold back from just, reflecting on the type of work you're doing, also the type of organizations you work with, because I think that's also another challenge that you can find yourself in, and that is, working with organizations pretty much involved in humanitarian aid. But again, going back to this idea of politics, where you feel that even education is being used as a political tool to create what is called change, or this idea of connecting education as a tool to, stop conflict or fight conflict. So especially with what's happening, the genocide in Gaza, I think these questions and these discursive concepts really grew with me. Like, what do we mean by emergency? Why are we connecting education with humanitarian aid, and who's doing that? Why are they doing that? And I think in our conversation, if like last week, I think I mentioned that it was, to me, it was really a moment to just be very direct and honest with myself, and seeing that I really do not value working with organizations that have double standards, or organizations that function, let's say, in Gaza or Palestinian territories, but also have other violent, acts, or, they support other agendas, or they maybe support Palestinian, let's say, teachers or students, but they're not really supporting them to fulfill their role as people looking for freedom, of people who are actually already fighting for their own freedom. So going back to this idea of sumud, I think for me, you actually see it happening in action in places like Gaza, for instance, where people are literally dying every single day. They're getting displaced tens of times a day because they don't want to give up their land. As a scholar, or as an emerging scholar in intercultural competence and global education, I keep asking myself this question every day, like, people are doing everything not to give up their land. What is it that I actually am ready to sacrifice to say the truth, or to actually act in the face of coloniality and promoting decolonial work, or being part of it, actually? And that's really not an easy question. I feel that it's easy to say these words, that you're willing to do things, you're willing to give up things, but when it comes to practice, especially when you're really that close to people who are, for instance, literally losing their lives and ones, you start just belittling yourself, and you see, like, okay, it's really not that easy to maybe work on something one day and then like give up just because you feel that you cannot just continue, or you're alone, or you're not pretty much heard. So as you can see, actually, I think it's very clear in what I'm sharing. I'm still processing a lot of this. When I started my graduate studies, even before, when I started, for instance, working on my master's, I worked, on the intercultural competence, factor in English language curricula in Jordan. I was very much surprised that it was mostly, Western based. It was mostly frameworks and models that certain people think that, everybody should fit under. It all started from there, and it, started growing. In virtual exchange, for instance, I do my best to gather graduate students from not just the global south, but really every part of the world, and discuss what it means to them, what it means to be in this virtual space with their students, to promote critical thinking, and talk about global issues, or do this and that. So you do feel that, and also personally, as someone from Palestine, Jordan, Muslim, hijabi, Arab female, you feel like there are so many descriptions, or very descriptors of who you are, that help you, actually. At the same time, they're challenging, but they really do help you shape what do you want to be and what you are in this context. So yeah, I think there are lots of weird things that I said, but it's just, as I said, it's really, it's a moment of processing and reflecting. I'm still really processing, for instance, what's happening in the West Bank and Gaza and the work that we need to be doing, to what extent it really matters, what actually matters, because lots of people, for instance, these days, you talk about rebuilding higher education, rebuilding education, but again, it's the question of to what extent the decolonial work that we initiate or we are part of really supports, you know, locals' voices versus, you know, you really wanting to help but being part of a hidden agenda and you don't know it, if that makes sense, or like you're not reflecting deeply enough on the role you're taking in supporting these communities.
Thank you, Hiba, for sharing from that heart space and for raising the questions, the important question at this moment to all of us, and especially for those who resonate with decolonial theories, with going beyond the capitalistic and neoliberal system. We will have a second moment to explore more and dive deeper, and I'm going to give now the floor to my colleague Francesca Helm.
Okay, thank you, and thanks for so much for inviting me to be part of this panel. I feel like I need to say something about my locus of enunciation and then link to what Hiba has been saying. So you can tell I'm a white female professor of English at a university in northern Italy, where I was first employed as a native speaker of English, again, based on these misguided native speakerist racial linguistic ideologies. So in one ways, it was a position of privilege, but also in Italian academia, it was kind of a subaltern place. But anyway, now I'm working in a department of political science that has changed a lot in Italy with all this internationalization and the rise of English medium instruction. It's kind of becoming an internationalized context in some ways. So in the last 5 years, the student body in my political science department, we have a lot of students from global south context, students racialized as non-white in a very Italian, as Francesca described, white institution, same university she studied at, and a country where there is structural and institutional racism, also racist violence and discourse, even more now with the current government. And yet one of the greatest offenses in Italy is to say that Italy is a racist country. Because, you know, Italiani brava gente, as they say. And in relation to decolonial work in my context, I found resonance in the panel yesterday about Palestine and Lebanon when Professor Maher, he said, producing emancipatory knowledge requires engagement with progressive social and political movements, and then also making transnational connections with academics. Particularly since there are few in our institutions working on emancipatory knowledge. So as you can see, for me, that all this decolonial has come through engaging with decolonial theory and thinkers like Juliana, Jhuliane, and Roxana, and other colleagues from Brazil, and through this kind of academic exchange and dialogue, so often online. Hiba was talking about virtual exchange and these online collaborations where you kind of interact very much on an equal status and create this community, this relationality. To me, is really important in terms of decoloniality and also co-teaching. So it's not kind of jumping in as a guest teacher, but really thinking and teaching and planning together, which with Juliana, one of the Jews, we've been doing recently, this idea of actually working together, you know, in planning and designing. But then to go to the trampas and to link to what Hiba was saying, but first, and also the global south, there is a global south in Padova in many ways. And what I see kind of decolonial practices is not in the university, but I've been learning through collaborations with anti-racist migrant solidarity and political activists. And so you see this outside of the university in a context where increasing illegalization of migrants and asylum seekers, and also criminalization of solidarity actors now. And so this is where I see the space for also knowledge. And it was that perhaps led me and colleagues to think about how to change the spaces we're working in. I mean, for goodness sake, the university is where you should be able to make change, and yet it's one of the most difficult places to change. And so with colleagues, 6 years ago, we engaged with this idea also about, bringing the South to the North and having kind of expanding the ecology of knowledges and perhaps co-opting this kind of neoliberal international agenda by engaging with scholars at risk, and the idea of bringing scholars from kind of trying to set up positions using this kind of idea of internationalization, who have been, persecuted in their countries. So we kind of obviously with other colleagues worked in this network of scholars at risk, and increasing the number of scholars, because there are very few international scholars working in Italy, and we thought by cashing in on what they want, we could do this. But again, you have this issue, right? So also what Hiba was saying, what are we doing? We're bringing people into a country where they won't have any academic future, where they don't have the language to defend themselves, where you're kind of, are we putting them more at risk than not doing this? And so, yeah, this is kind of one of the questions that I think will be interesting also to discuss. Now, how do we enact these translocal solidarities? Are online solutions, again, thinking about Gaza, is that the answer? But then these online solutions, they can also be co-opted, right? So I think that a lot of projects that the European Commission has been doing, I've worked with them on these virtual exchange projects, and then now I get a sense that they're kind of using online engagements as a way of keeping people out. So it's a way of saying, we're doing something, but we're keeping people in their places, right? Same with the universities and this whole idea of scholars at risk, right? We're giving them a pretext to not take a political stance, perhaps, right? So they say, yeah, well, we have like 2 scholars at risk and we have students at risk. And so that's it. We're doing our kind of humanitarian ethical thing. So they can put their scholars at risk badge on their website and yet not actually do anything about it, not really engage with the knowledges on an equal basis, etc. And then, have them doing our work and then, oh, goodbye, your contract has ended. There's nothing we can do. You could perhaps ask for asylum, and not support in this process. So this is the traps and the discomforts that I think I feel through this.
Thank you, Francesca, and also for touching upon those important contradictions.
Exactly.
I want to ask my colleagues, Juliana and or Jhuliane, if they want to add something to this question and raise a different inquiry to us.
Julie, do you want to go? No.
No, you may, my dear.
No, thank you so much, Francesca's and Hiba, for sharing with us this experience and bringing the project and the discomfort. And this is the conversation that we have been going on and how we see our spaces. And I just wanted to emphasize that sometimes when we speak from a geographical global south, so sometimes people hear us speaking from Brazil and from Chile and other countries, they automatically sometimes project the idea that the Eurocentric's not here. So we are using different knowledges, we are doing different work, and we are working with decolonial theory, but the discomfort is quite the same, in the sense that I also see myself in this very Eurocentric and white university in the south of the country, and the country is also projected in lots of hierarchies. So it doesn't mean that because we are in this geographical global south that the epistemological global north and the Eurocentric perspective is not there. So in this sense, just to emphasize. And the contradiction that we see here when we hear the 3 colleagues and we also see the work that we are trying to do is this perspective that we work with decolonial studies, decolonial theory, global south perspectives, but actually the question that Hiba raised, how are we really hearing those voices, or how are we really finding ourselves in solidarity practice that are different from just the rhetorical discursive way of reproducing. So the same discomfort and impossibilities we see in our work, even in our academic spaces, with the students at the university, with the communities that we engage. So yes, just to emphasize that, making it clear this locus of enunciation in terms of geographical and epistemological spaces. Julie and Rox?
Yeah, and I'm seeing, go.
Hiba is with her hand,
Yes.
right? Yeah, please, Hiba, then I can add something.
Yeah, sorry, I'm trying to lower my hand. Okay, I'm not sure if it's lowered or not. I think just to kind of follow up on this, and the importance of solidarity and this collaborative space where everybody gets together to learn about our different experiences in decolonial work and our experiences with coloniality, etc. I think one of the biggest concerns, especially nowadays with the technology and the speed of technology and the world of social media, that we need to always pay attention to and also reflect on, is that we don't want the decolonial work to be a trend, right? Like, we don't want it to be trendy. And I'm seeing this, for instance, with Gaza, for instance, across the world, or what's happening. And because the genocide started 15, 16, 17 months ago, there was a time where you felt like, everybody wanted to talk about Palestine, everybody wanted to do things, and that's great. But I think the most important thing is that we continue doing this. And every single scholar, every single Palestinian, for instance, in Gaza right now, if there's one thing they keep telling me, is that please do not stop talking about us. Please do not stop talking about the genocide, even when, I don't know if when it ends is even the right place to put it, because ceasefire doesn't mean the end of the genocide, as we've, I think, seen in the past few weeks when the attacks renewed in Gaza. But we don't want things to be a trend in a way that we all talk about, a particular context, or we use decolonial theory in certain approaches and then never really continue to build on this work, and learning from other contexts and kind of, coming together. And actually, maybe this is an invitation to this conference, or also, networks involved. I think it could be a great thing to create this space where, scholars, practitioners, everybody who's participated or been part of this event in some form, to continue the conversation and continue teaching each other and learning from one another about what's really happening in their own context, and how then we could learn from it and grow with it. So yeah, I guess, this idea of, especially also with journals and publishers, sometimes you feel there's a trend towards publishing about decolonial work, which is great, again, but are we really engaging with this research? Are we really bringing practitioners, right, academics, non-academics together to actually reflect on this and see, how we are benefiting, if that's a word even to use here, from what's been produced, the knowledge we're producing? Are we really producing this knowledge and sharing this philosophy just for the sake of it? Or are we really producing this for, a more noble, I would say, human goal, which is really reflecting on what's happening in our societies and in our lives, and actually take action, or try to take action as much as we can, and think of the possibilities for change.
Thank you, Hiba. Thank you for those reflections. Juliana, I know that you wanted to add the conversation.
Yes. It's just because I was thinking of so many things that have been told, and they are so important, but some of them that resonated a lot, and I can say two things. One, about the consistency. I think I heard Hiba saying about that, right? And this is one of the words that Jhuliane, Rox, and I have also been talking. It's not about coherence. It's not about sameness, right, Ju? It is about consistency and trying to find space, to hold space for the tensions, right, for the contradictions, and to keep fighting for what we believe it is right, without understanding right or wrong, without in the binaries, right, without considering things in binary ways, but fighting for the other who is being othered all the time, who is being actively excluded. And this, we have to consider our locus of enunciation. We have to consider the spaces in which we are, right, apart. So, for example, as Jules was talking about her institutional space, I also have this privileged space, right? But if we consider her city, her university, and mine, I am in the global south, right? And she is in the global north. But at the same time, everything that I choose to take to my institution, to my students, the way I assess them, the way I connect with them, right? This has to do with this different understanding of decoloniality that I think we all have been trying to say here, right? It has a lot to do with this transformation. It is about relationality. It is about going beyond this consumerist idea of being with the other, of relating to the other, right? So I think that one of the biggest gifts and one of the biggest ways of going beyond those threats that I see in my institution is what we are doing here, is the sanghas that we have been proposing, is to have the possibility of opening a chat or making a video call and being able to cry and to complain, but to also to think of so many things as Hiba was doing here as well. Because we need the connection. We need to feel the compromise, right? We need to how can I say? We need to see our place and our space in the world as codependent, you know? So everything against capitalism, it is not about it is about capitalism, but it is not only about socialist views or these other named views that we are dealing here, right? It is about a different way of existing, of coexisting, of promoting what we want to promote, because we believe the way things are is not okay, right? Thank you.
Thank you, Gio. And considering the time that I mentioned, the colonial time and the agenda, we want to broaden in the dialogue. Yeah, we are crossed by the colonial time, right? And normally we think of it as a linear dimension. We have to do more, and we are more human doing than human beings. But now we are going to invite you to take a breath and broaden the dialogue. And would love to hear from you. And yes, and raise questions and raise experiences. I know that we have only 15 minutes, but we can go beyond the rule of the 15 minutes if we want. Yes, because there is no presentation. I think that we have the lunchtime. So yes, please.
Sorry, I was eager, a little too eager. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the intentions of the panel. And so I just want to ask a couple of questions that might be a little challenging, especially for people who have come from the global south and entered academia. And so this idea, like, is it privilege? Yeah. And so I want to actually quote Spivak from her really famous essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? Which I'm sure you all may have read. And she writes that the subaltern as a female cannot be heard or read when a line of communication is established between a member of subaltern groups and the circuits of citizenship or institutionality. The subaltern has been inserted into the long road to hegemony. Unless we want to be romantic purists, this is absolutely to be desired. And she had got a lot of bad criticism for that. But essentially she's saying the subaltern cannot be heard unless they speak the language of hegemony. And so if we're trying to be decolonial, obviously, and there are ways to be decolonial, are we putting the subaltern at a disadvantage if she is in that position? She ends up through trials and whatever in that position, right? And for us in these institutions. And so I don't know if I have an answer, but it's something to think about. But practically thinking, I don't know if we should necessarily, because we're all stuck, right? We're in this, I think Francesca said it, we're stuck. We have to in this institution, for instance, we have to publish, we have to reproduce the way knowledge is produced, right, in order to be relevant. But maybe like, you know, you mentioned South-South connections. I would say citation, like maybe be very selective about who you cite. Cite brown women, you know. I don't know. And again, it might make your work not as credible, but that's an option. Another thing is application materials. They tend to be standardized, so teaching philosophies. And so sometimes you might hear from people whose priorities might not align with what you think they should be. And so you should listen to those. And so I think those are more practical ways. Yeah, sorry, I'm speaking from, that's my focus for the investigation.
Thank you. Thank you.
But that's what I wanted to
Thank
add.
you so much for your question. And your name?
Maya Agassi, sorry, from Maya Agassi. I'm from the American University of Chicago.
We're taking over your question. Yeah. Is there another comment? Oh, yeah, please.
Yeah, I'm also from the American University of Sharjah with Maya. And I wanted to add something to this because we all both come from the Global South and we have been working actively in decoloniality through making our voices heard. And part of making our voices heard is to use Spivak again, is to listen to the silence. And I was thinking about the silence in Palestine, not about Palestine. And to use Spivak's point of view, we have to understand, as your picture is showing, that many people in Gaza right now don't have the language to express, forget the means and the material means. They don't speak the Western language. And Spivak, in the same essay, which I can quote by heart, says, for the subaltern to be heard, they have to speak the capitalist language. And right now, people cannot. So it becomes our duty to make those voices heard using some of the Western methods. And Magnolia has worked so hard on establishing how we can think across borders. And this is what we do in our work, that we employ the epistemologies of the South and the North. And it's hard, it's challenging, but we do that, I think, it's a price we have to pay to make those voices heard. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I want to take up on that with the prices we pay, right?
Yeah.
I think it's fascinating that we are here talking about being comfortable with discomfort, because being a place of privilege, it takes a lot of just consciousness of where we are and to the comforts that we have to address that as a place of discomfort. And I come from Brazil too, and I started a university there, and then I went to Canada as an international student. And I remember as an international student in Canada, it was the first time I felt at home in higher education, because I never had, this was the late 90s, I never had a female professor before, or a young professor, a Black professor, or a gay professor. And so I understand that Juliana and Francesca talk about sameness and invisibility, right? There is, and we were talking about this before, about how do we go about doing reparation, in the sense that it's not, because this has been used for oppressive purposes, that's not to say that it's not a place of power. And the fact is, we're now in a position that we didn't used to have access to this power. We know the harmful effects that it has, but we can use it for good. And then Trumpers for Trumpers, we can use Trumpers. We know authentically where our heart is, and we can see the dance that we dance, and the publications, and the price we pay, the price we pay to play the game. But then how we decide to use that in ways that makes this space a voice for people who do not have voice, and how can we make it less hostile and more welcoming? And the sense that we feel in different ways we feel outsiders, but we actually did get here. And what does that get us in terms of traction to make this place, I don't know that less hostile is the word, more welcoming is the word, but it is a power that we have, and we can wield it for better or for worse, right? So it is a privilege to be here in this room with all of you and online. And again, just think of the privilege of having this meeting point of people who are concerned with discomfort and displacement. So yes, so not a question, but thank you for bringing up these issues of all the discomforts that being in a comfortable place brings when we're thinking about terms of oppression and social justice and how knowledge production and reproduction plays a part into it. So thank you.
Thank you so much for those comments. And I am noticing that Hiba has her hand raised, and there is another comment from the chat from the people who are joining us online. So Pablo, I give you the mic in a second. Hiba, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on the comments in the room. Thank you so much for sharing this. One of the things that I've been very careful about, recently, although I don't have those much collaborations yet, but I recently co-authored this article that is hopefully coming out with a colleague from Bosnia. And we were having this conversation about how we could show solidarity and support our decolonial work through collaborations. And I think it's one of the things that we need to really think of is whom we collaborate with. And I mean, knowing them. You know, like sometimes we collaborate with people just to publish a paper or do a book, but do we really feel safe collaborating with these people? Do we feel like our honest selves when we collaborate with certain people? And I think this is very important because if we really don't get to know other scholars whom you collaborate with, or if you feel that you're even self-censoring in their presence, then what's the point of collaborating, right? Like, what's really the point of doing this work without feeling that you can be your 100% self with colleagues whom, you know, might claim that they share certain, you know, experiences or backgrounds or even, you know, passions about this particular work with you. And I think that was a really powerful, you know, kind of point that we had a discussion on, because especially the more critical and, you know, the more tense certain topics become in this world, and some global issues become, if you really want to talk about them and make a difference or engage at least in a discussion with others, if you really cannot feel that you can do this fully, openly with others, then there's a problem, right? So I think that's really one thing that I think it's kind of in a response to the first comment. And I think what the second comment came with about silence and silencing. It's exactly the same thing when we say that. It just reminds me of peace education, right? And we sometimes think that if there's absence of violence, absence of conflict, peace is achieved, which is, you know, obviously not true at all. And I think, again, reflecting on not just these phrases or this type of pedagogies, but also how we get involved in them and our role and how we support, I think is even more critical to reflect on these days with what's happening. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of make these quick comments on what's been shared in the room. Thank you.
Pablo? Would you like to speak to your comment? What did I do? I think I have. Yeah, I got it. Okay. I don't know if Pablo can hear me.
It's Juliana.
Oh, sorry, my dear. No, I was just moderating, but I think this is a great time for us to ask if anyone who is in the chat or who is with us now online, virtually, would like to ask a question, right? Because sometimes you may not have access to the chat. So please open your mic, join the conversation. We are here to listen to you as well.
I would like to perhaps share our experience of doing this work and thinking with my colleagues to get allowed. So how we move beyond? We know about the traps, we know about the constraints, and if there is any other space to build, what are the generative emotional states that can invite us to think beyond the roles that are playing? And what it has helped me a lot is the praise of meditation, and meditation as a way to connect with those deepest intentions that are there. Like when you remove those ego desires, what is really, really moving and brings you to academia? What is the real purpose of showing up? Today, I must confess with you, before having this chat, I said, what is really what I want to happen after this? Beyond having just another seminar talk, that we get together, that we touch that space in our hearts that mobilize us, that we can show up in the world in a way that we can practice what many of us believe in terms of the decolonial inspiration. Of the colonial, when we engage with these theories, it's because there's a part of us that feel we want a different future. And it seems I feel systematic, trapped, constrained by the academic rules. And I notice that gap. I want something different, but I'm still so invested in this, with this hat of the academic hat, that there are things that are stopping me. So the deepest intention today, what we share with my colleagues, was, okay, let's engage in a dialogue that allow us perhaps to mobilize outside of us, to connect, relate, listen, maybe slow down, to listen to to the voices that are not here, to notice the presence that we are missing in this room. So thank you so much for allowing us to have this space. It's a time to cultivate the hope, and it's a time to cultivate the solidarity. Any additional word? And I wasn't, you can see that my technical skills.
No.
Let me see if I put all of you. There it is. Any other words? We are all looking at you, dear ones.
Oh, you're looking at us here.
Yeah.
You are looking at us here. Yeah. It's so funny to be online, not being there with you. Yeah, it's a little bit strange. No, I just want to thank you also for all of you being here and for our friends for this panel. And I work with language education, so it was very interesting to hear the comments that we got from you, the audience. When I think about language and all of the concerns that we have here, who are we collaborating with, who are we talking with, and how to create a space of listening to each other. And then if you notice that lots of the examples that we brought are related to these intercultural experiences. And then comes the idea of language, the concerns that we have. What is a dialogue? What is communication? And what is this silence when we are together? So this is one of the aspects that we also have been discussing in the sense of looking at not a linear communication and not understanding each other, but looking at translation, for example, finding spaces in which conflict, tension, doubt, and not understanding are going to be part of the conversation. So the conversation is not going to be clear in this sense because we are not understanding each other. And even when we think about the question of the subaltern, should the subaltern learn the dominant language, or should the dominant ones learn how to hear the other? So when we keep, this is also a trap in the sense that we are trying to find a common language. So when I think about, for example, this effort of having a lingua franca, let's imagine that all of us could speak the same language. The question would be the same. Would this language solve the problem of not understanding each other, of not hearing each other? So this is very interesting how all of the ideas that we brought today and the questions that we heard, the comments that we heard, connected to this epistemic privilege, the position of learning how to hear the other, learning how to listen to the other, but then it comes integrated with the translation of the other and the locus of enunciation. So it's a double practice that we do. I listen to the other, but I also have to listen to myself, because I have to understand how I'm listening to the other and why I'm not hearing the other. So it's always a sense of learning about ourselves in this relational process. So this is very powerful to see that with all the things that we heard here and the experiences, we come to this question of language. How are we really engaging in language in terms? So just to share a thought that I had here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Juliana. Thank you all of you.